Yes, hello once again, welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, where we continue to take a look at more of those old school vintage dirt bikes from way back in the day. Now, just before we get down to our next video posting, I'd just like to say a quick hello to some of the Classic Dirt Bike TV subscribers that I met at the recent 2023 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show. It was nice to meet a few of you in person, and thanks once again for all your many positive comments on my video postings. So right now we're going to get down to our first video from the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, and this next featured bike is another one of those extremely rare machines as part of the Terry Pickering Classic Dirt Bike collection. So let's get into that video now and take a look at this lovely 1982-83 440 AJS Rotax. Okay, so this featured bike here is just the first of many machines that we'll be showcasing from the 2023 Classic Dirt Bike Show that was held at the Telford International Centre on the 11th and 12th of February. So let's just kick off by taking a look at a very rare British built bike, and as per many of the other super rare machines that I feature here on my channel, this bike once again is another gem from the Terry Pickering Classic Motorcycle collection. Now, at first glance, this bike may look like something that somebody's cobbled together using all of their old motorcycle parts that have been lying around their workshop, but in actual fact this bike here is just one of only two prototypes that were built by the AJS Motorcycle company, and this example here was actually raced by Fluff Brown's son Nick in 1983. Now, unsurprisingly though, there didn't appear to be much information or background regarding the history of this motorcycle, but Terry's only recently just completed the rebuild of this bike, because before that this machine was just a collection of old AJS and other bike parts that had been gathering dust since the early 1980s, although Terry now tells me that he's in the process of restoring this bike's twin, so that he can then add both of these very rare Fluff Brown prototypes to his collection. But as I said, details about this entire project are sceptical at the very least, and I can only assume that the frame is almost certainly made by AJS and designed naturally to accept this Rotax two-stroke motor. But the front down tube and the engine cradle and rear subframe certainly look like they're made of light gauge tubular steel, which was always a manufacturing trademark of the old AJS Stormer bikes of the 1970s, because they were light in their construction but very strong in terms of their ruggedness and build quality. But the swing arm, as you can see, was basically just a simple box section item made of steel, and it certainly looked like it was well up to the job of keeping the back end of this bike in check. But the chain adjusters were just simple lock nut and screw affairs, but then again this was still an experimental motorcycle, so any of these parts could have been changed or even substituted at any time if the bike was further developed. And so moving on to our AJS's power plant, and as you can see, no Villiers motor in this particular bike, and an Austrian-made Rotax two-stroker is chosen in its place. And it's also documented that it was Fluff Brown who bought two of these Rotax engines from Armstrong to go into his two brand new experimental motorbikes. But when Nick Brown raced this machine back in 1983, he just assumed that the motor it was a 410cc unit, and he even raced it as such, but it was only some time later that he then discovered that it was actually a 440 unit. And in terms of their performance, these Rotax engines certainly have a very good reputation for their power and reliability, and these lightweight, compact and very quick engines were a perfect choice to fit to any off-road motocross machine, because in the late 1970s and early 80s these Rotax motors were powering a multitude of different makes and models of motocrossers during that era. Now, on the transmission side, it was just a simple wet multi-plate clutch that was connected onto the crankshaft by way of a little spur gear, and not by a primary chain as some of the other manufacturers used on similar two-stroke engines. But on the ignition side of the motor, it was a relatively modern style electronic CDI unit that supplied all of the sparks for the single cylinder and its spark plug. But to keep the weight of this Rotax engine to a decent level, a certain amount of magnesium was also used in some of the engine's casings, which of course all helped towards keeping the all-up weight of the bike to a respectable level. Now, to feed this 440 two-stroker with its fuel, a quite sizable 54mm Bing carburetor was used, and although these older Bing carbs may look a bit dated and a little antiquated, if they're set up right and jetted correctly, they're every bit as good as any Japanese Mikuni or similar product. Now, when Terry first got hold of all of the bits and pieces of this rare bike, one of the parts that were missing was the original exhaust expansion chamber, and naturally, because this was basically a one-off build, you couldn't just phone up AJS and ask them for a replacement. So Terry then had to call in a specialist to make a custom replacement exhaust pipe for the bike. And Terry did tell me that it was quite a long, drawn-out process to get this pipe made to specifically fit around the frame and the engine, because the manufacturer had no template or old part to use as a reference. So once Terry had more or less completed the biggest part of the build, he then handed over the complete bike in order that this new pipe could be manufactured. But it was all eventually completed, and hopefully the process will be a lot easier when it comes to making a pipe for bike number 2. But this alloy tailpipe here, as far as I'm aware, was another part taken from another off-road machine, maybe an old Maiko or something similar, because other than the chassis of this bike, Fluff Brown just used whichever parts were available to him to put together this new prototype experimental machine. Now, if you know your off-road motocrossers, then you may have already spotted that Fluff Brown has used a set of Yamaha YZ forks on this bike, and he's also kept the Yamaha's front brake hub with its twin leading shoe front brake as well. But to keep all of those complicated and various parts together, he's also kept the original YZ Yamaha front wheel as well. But you can see Fluff Brown's thinking here by using these YZ forks, because for the early 1980s these were pretty good suspension units for their day, and the likes of maybe the old 1970s AJS Stormer forks probably wouldn't have been up to the job. So these YZ units were still a pretty good alternative. And as I said, the Yamaha front end had this twin leading shoe front brake system in the 1980s, and by all accounts these brakes were very good stoppers, and they'll be perfectly suited here on our much lighter 440 AJS prototype. Although, as you're aware, this was just still an experimental machine, and I suppose that all manner of brakes and suspensions could have eventually found their way onto the final specifications of the new bike if it was ever put into production. But as I said, this featured bike here and its sibling were about as far as the experiment went. Now, on the rear hub, and in sharp contrast to the Yamaha front end, AJS raided their stock of old bike parts and used a rear hub and wheel from his massive collection of AJS Stormer spares. And this wheel again here is an alloy Acront unit which has been respoked and replaced onto the Stormer brake hub. Now, the rear brake on our prototype bike is just a stock old school drum type affair. Not the most powerful of its day, but certainly adequate to help slow down that rear wheel whenever required. But again, quite a sizable rear sprocket on our AJS, all done of course to get that gearing just right for our Rotax engine's gearbox. And judging by the look at the size of this sprocket, this bike could quite easily fly off the line in third gear and still get the whole shot with no shifting required in between. And once more, we have a nicely manufactured alloy chain guide there below that swing arm, just to help keep the chain tracking straight and true on both of the drive sprockets, because it's quite a familiar occurrence seeing chains flying off motocross race bikes if you just haven't got that tension set absolutely spot on. And so at our AJS's rear end we have a single monoshock suspension unit, but from which manufacturer I'm not entirely sure, but it could quite easily be maybe a white power shock of some description. And it's also fitted with a substantial remote gas and oil reservoir there on the left hand side. But again, this reservoir is mainly placed onto the outside of the bike to try and keep it in the flow of the air, to try and help it keep cool, because these gas and oil reservoirs do have a tendency to heat up if they're worked very hard and tucked up out of the way of oncoming cooling air. But the rear shock was just simply bolted onto the frame at the top and then fixed onto the bike's swing arm by way of a linkage on the bottom. So in its way it was quite a radical layout even for 1982. Now, moving on to the fuel tank on our rear AJS, and you can go to the top of the class if you've already guessed that this was a plastic tank borrowed from the mighty German Michaels of that same year. No graphics or badges on this tank to identify it as an AJS part, because this is exactly how this fuel cell was presented back in the day, as it had no markings of any kind to let you know what kind of bike it actually was. But when Fluff Brown's son Nick rode this bike in 1983, this fuel tank did have a white tank cover slipped over the top of it, although Nick himself did race the bike with one of their Team FJB Andover race shirts on, which helped identify at least who was in the saddle. Although, to be fair, this Michael tank certainly did fit the AJS chassis very well, and naturally it was big enough to hold all of the fuel required to feed that very thirsty 440 Rotax two-stroke engine. Now I'm guessing here again because I'm not entirely certain as to which make or manufacturer made the seat for this bike, but the chances are that because Yamaha and Meiko parts have been used in this bike's construction, it's more than likely that the seat's also been taken from one of those aforementioned models. But it could be a Yamaha YZ seat because of the reddish colour, but again, it could even be a Meiko seat that's had a red type cover slipped onto it. But as I said, I don't know, and because this was a prototype motorcycle, details and information about it are not exactly readily available. So to be truthful with regards to the seat, I really just haven't got a clue. But the bike's plastics have almost certainly come from the AJS's parts bins, and once again no identifying race numbers or other stamps on them to signify their origins, but they certainly look the part and fit the bike perfectly, and they're simply secured onto the chassis by just a pair of small screws. Now the bike's front and rear mudguards are stock off-the-shelf motocross items as far as I know, and these are easily available in all good motocross stores or off the internet at various websites. And this front plastic number plate again is a pretty stock motocross racing part that originally would have had a red background and white numbers on it, but the pictures that I've seen of Nick Brown riding one of these bikes, they did have a square white front number plate on it, and not this oval black item seen here. Although, having said that, those pictures could have quite easily have been the brother of this bike that I'd seen, and not our featured machine. But once again, most of our AJS's controls are pretty much stock racing parts, more than likely raided from the AJS spares parts department, and these old school handlebars are almost certainly from the late 1970s or early 80s, because they still have the racing crossbar welded on rather than the more modern method of using a couple of clamps to secure them. But those alloy ball end levers are without doubt classic Magura items, with one on both the clutch and front brake, and just to control all of the horses waiting to be unleashed from that 440 Rotax motor, we have a good quality Swedish made Gunnar Gasser throttle twist grip as well. Although when the late Fluff Brown built this bike way back in the early 1980s, I'm not exactly sure as to what his intentions were with regards the build of this bike, because I don't expect that they could have ever called it an AJS motorcycle because of all the different types of manufacturers' parts that were fitted onto it. But my guess is that it was built purely just to raise the profile of the once great name of AJS when their fantastic old Stormer bikes of the late 1960s and early 70s were competing at the highest level at motocross events all over the UK. But as I already mentioned, this bike was just one of only two machines built by AJS in 1982, and Terry now owns both of them, and he is currently in the process of rebuilding that second bike, which strangely enough has a different suspension system to our featured machine. But who knows, hopefully in the not too distant future we'll also be able to take a look at that bike when Terry gets it finished. Although when everything's all said and done, this is still a very rare machine regardless of its purpose or build concept. And Fluff Brown's son Nick certainly raced one or both of these bikes at one time during 1983, but as to how much successes he achieved while doing so, I don't exactly know. But yet another rare classic for Terry to add to his already humongous assortment of old dirt bikes, but more importantly, another otherwise unknown motocross classics being saved, and all part of the continuing AJS Motorcycles history. Well, there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed that walk around that lovely AJS 440 Rotax machine. A bike, as I said, is just one of only two bikes made by Fluff Brown in the early 1980s, but a nice addition to Terry Pickering's classic collection. So coming up next, we're going to continue with more machines from the 2023 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, and in this next video posting we'll be taking a look at a couple of machines from Keith Ree, and we'll start off by taking a look at his lovely 440 Michael from 1978, and we'll follow that up with his quite nice CR500 Honda Evolution bike, and both of these bikes were up for sale over the course of the 2 days of the show. And we'll also be including this fantastic CCM machine that was built by Jem Parker. So look out for these three machines coming up in my next video posting here on Classic Dirt Bike TV. But until the next time, take care of yourself, and it's goodbye for now.